This is the Ben Shapiro Show. Joining us on the line is Lieutenant Colonel Dakota Wood, Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation. Today, Heritage releases its Index of Military Strength. It's essentially a report card for the armed forces. Lieutenant Colonel, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
A real great honor to be with you. Thank you.
So why don't we discuss this report card? How does the U.S. stack up just generally today, and then in comparison to where the U.S. military was when President Trump took office?
Right. So right now, readiness is much better, but it's still too old in terms of a lot of its equipment, and it's much, much too small. So in military affairs, working with big things, you can only do so much in a short period of time. It is dramatically better off today since President Trump took office than it was 4 or 5 years ago. So this focus on near-term readiness, if you've got a small force, it has to be competent and capable and staffed with good people. And he's really focused on making sure we have that. The problem is funding irregularity, continuing resolutions, lack of programmatic support from Congress that makes it very difficult to get new equipment into the pipeline. So a lot of the stuff our military has bought back in the 1980s. Most of our ships are greater than 20, 25 years old. And the average age of an Air Force fighter is 30 years old, if you can imagine that. So we've got a long way to go, but by golly, President Trump did just enormous work in helping to get the force ready.
So when President Trump took office, thanks to sequestration, there had been tremendous cuts to military readiness. There was talk about how the United States was not capable of fighting war on two separate fronts or two simultaneous wars. Where do we land on that scale now?
We still have a one-war force. So when you look at historically what it's taken in military power to go up against a peer adversary, not knucklehead jihadis in Afghanistan or insurgents in Iraq with no Navy, no Air Force, no armor. We're talking, conventional war. When we make advances in artificial intelligence and robots and these sorts of things, our competitors are doing the same thing. Just look at what China and Russia are investing in. So when it comes down to it, you have to have a sufficient capacity to not only get to the fight and engage it, but actually outlast. You're going to take losses and your opponent's going to take losses. So the force we have today, its size, could handle a major conflict in one part of the world, but it would take everything we've got, and it leaves all of our other interests uncovered in those other regions where we can't be.
So there's been a lot of talk on the left side of the aisle about America's military readiness, and the suggestion, of course, is constantly that America spends too much money on national defense. How do we stack up vis-a-vis other countries in terms of what we spend on national defense, and why is that justified or not justified based on our national interest?
Well, there's purchasing power parity, right? So it's just more expensive to make things here in the United States because of regulatory compliance and quality of life and all these other sorts of things that we really put a lot of value on. You don't see the same thing in China. China invests in its military. It's all used locally there, and it's near abroad and in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region. For us to guard our interests, we have to project military power 3,000 and 4,000 and 5,000 miles away. It takes 3 weeks to get a battle group from the United States to the South China Sea. So when you get over there, you don't have the same sorts of basing infrastructure, the same sorts of capacity to rely on land-based capabilities. So that's what people often miss, is this disparity in what it takes for the United States to defend things a great ways away, whereas everybody else gets to fight, on a home field advantage. So historically, if you looked at the Cold War, about 5% of GDP, $20 trillion economy, on average, in our history, that would be a $1 trillion defense budget, right? Right now we're at 3.1, 3.2%. We're not even keeping pace with inflation. The cost of people to outfit the average soldier has increased 16 times more than the rate of inflation since the Vietnam era. So it shows you what it takes to fight modern war. And we're not even keeping pace with inflation these days.
We're speaking with Lieutenant Colonel Dakota Wood, Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation. So our friends on the left are constantly saying things like, well, the United States really doesn't end up using this massive capacity force at any point. We usually end up engaging in low-level conflicts, and for example, in Libya, as President Obama did, or we end up engaging in drone wars. What is the necessity for having a force this large and this powerful if the prospect of a full-scale land war in Asia, for example, with the Chinese is probably not on the table?
Well, it's the cycles of history, right? That you're always competing. The world is a dynamic place. So to think that China doesn't want to expand its own capabilities. They muscle aside Vietnamese shipping vessels. They try to get undersea minerals and resources and fisheries and all these sorts of things. They're building a massive navy. They've added more ships to the Chinese Navy in the last 3 years than are in the entire British Royal Navy. That's the pace at which they're expanding, and you've seen what Russia's done in Ukraine and Crimea, and in the Middle East. Was it Iran has something like 3,000 ballistic missiles. So serious powers devoting serious money. The fact that we haven't had a major war is because the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, 1992. Happy decade of the 90s, terrorist attacks in 2001, and we've been focused on those problems. In that intervening period of time, China has become a global economic power, and it's devoting a lot of its money and resources to this military capability that just outstrips anything else in the region. So in historical cycles, in the dynamic nature of state versus state competition, the U.S. has found itself, since its founding, in a big war about every 20 years. And I just don't think we've seen the end of history on that.
We're speaking with Lieutenant Colonel Dakota Wood, Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation. So looking at the readiness of America's forces, you mentioned that we have not re-upped our technology in the Air Force, that we have battleships that are incredibly old. If we have to prioritize, where should we be prioritizing at this point?
Well, I think it's going to be naval power because of the size of the oceans and where the vast majority of America's commerce applies through waters to get from one place to another. So naval power absolutely should be taking a focus, and then your air capabilities are what enable you to get someplace faster with types of ordnance that might be relevant to an immediate fight. The U.S. Army and the Marine Corps inherently land combat power, especially on the Army side. It's large, but boy, when it gets someplace, it dominates the battlefield. But in the tight nature of conflicts, in deterrence value and reassuring allies on a day-to-day basis, that's really where you see the value of maritime power, naval power. And it also takes the longest amount of time to build. It takes 5 years to build an aircraft carrier, 2 or plus years to build any other kind of surface warship. So if you're going to invest $1 today for benefit of the broadest value, you probably want to be looking at naval power in the near future.
Lieutenant Colonel Dakota Wood, Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation. On a slightly different note, President Trump has announced that he wants to see troop drawdowns in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. This has jogged all sorts of controversy on the right, with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell suggesting a precipitous pullout from Afghanistan could end with the slaughter of the allies that we have been helping to prop up there for now nigh on 2 decades. What do you make of the Trump administration's plans for withdrawal?
Well, he came into office with promises. He wants to reduce the U.S. military footprint in some of these regions, Afghanistan, in the Middle East in particular, with Iraq and some of the stuff going on in Syria. And I think that's always a noble cause. Why do you want to be having your troops walking over everybody's land and putting Americans in harm's way? The reason that occurs is because the United States feels that it has a critical interest that, yes, we want to address diplomatically and economically, but sometimes the person on the other side of that conversation just won't, shape their behaviors. And it takes military power to deter or to enforce your will over somebody else. So every year, every month, every week, we need to be reevaluating what is the United States interest, what does it take to secure that interest? And if it's military power, on balance, then you have to stay committed. If we decide that our priorities are elsewhere and we don't give, much attention to what's going on in Afghanistan, squeezed between Iran, Pakistan, nuclear-armed, Russia, and China, then we would, draw down accordingly. So the president is looking at that. He's looking at the small capacity of the U.S. military, other things that need to be done, and keeping in mind what he had promised those that had voted him into office 4 years ago. So I think it's that kind of a decision dynamic that's occurring in the White House. But, we aren't involved in that, so it's a bit of speculation and trying to second-guess what's going on from the outside.
Lieutenant Colonel Dakota Wood, Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation, really appreciate your time and really appreciate your insight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.